The badge. Margaret Eleanor Whitmore stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the pearls that had been her husband's last gift to her. 43 years of marriage, and she still reached for them whenever she needed to feel his presence. Today was special, her granddaughter Emma's wedding day. The house buzzed with activity downstairs. Caterers rushing about, florists making final adjustments, family members arriving in their finest attire. At 71, Margaret had learned to move carefully, not from frailty, but from a hard-earned wisdom about preserving her energy for what mattered. Today mattered. Emma, her bright-eyed 24-year-old granddaughter, was marrying a lovely young man named David, and Margaret had spared no expense to make it perfect. She descended the curved staircase of the Victorian home she and Harold had purchased in 1982, when property in this part of Connecticut was still affordable for a high school principal and his librarian wife. Now the house was worth nearly $2 million, though she tried not to think about that. Money had a way of changing how people looked at you. "Grandma Maggie!" Emma rushed over, her wedding dress a cloud of ivory silk that made her look like something from a fairy tale. "You look absolutely beautiful." Margaret's heart swelled. Emma had always called her Grandma Maggie, never the formal grandmother that her son Richard preferred she use. Emma had Harold's eyes, kind and mischievous at the same time. "Not half as beautiful as you, sweetheart." Margaret touched Emma's cheek gently. "Your grandfather would have been so proud." Emma's eyes misted. "I wish he could be here." "Oh, darling, he is. Trust me on that." Richard approached, looking harried in his expensive suit. At 45, he had Harold's height, but none of his warmth. Success as a financial advisor had given him sharp edges that Margaret sometimes didn't recognize as belonging to the boy who once built blanket forts in her living room. "Mom, we need to talk about the seating arrangements. Some of the vendors are asking about the financial arrangements. I think it would be appropriate if you wore one of those name tags just to help the staff know who to direct questions to." Margaret felt a small chill run down her spine. "Name tags? Just a formality," Richard said quickly. "You know, so the wedding planner knows who's handling what." Emma looked between them, confusion clouding her features. "What kind of name tag?" Vivian produced a small white badge from her purse. "Nothing dramatic, dear, just something simple." Margaret took the badge and nearly dropped it. In neat, professional lettering, it read, "The old lady who pays for everything." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at the badge, reading it again, certain she must have misunderstood. But there it was, in black and white, reducing her to nothing more than a checkbook with legs. This is what you think of me?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, don't be dramatic," Richard said, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "It's just practical." Emma snatched the badge from her grandmother's trembling hands. "Are you kidding me? This is disgusting." Her voice rose, drawing stares from nearby guests. "Grandma Maggie isn't paying for this because she has to. She's doing it because she loves me." "Emma, lower your voice," Vivian hissed. "You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene? You just handed my grandmother a name tag calling her the old lady who pays for everything, and I'm making a scene?" Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. Around them, conversations had stopped. Elegantly dressed relatives and friends were staring, and she could see the questions in their eyes, the way they were processing this moment, filing it away for later gossip. "I need some air," Margaret managed, and walked quickly toward the French doors that led to the garden. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of the last roses of the season. Margaret sank onto the stone bench Harold had installed beside her prized rose bushes. Her hands shook as she stared at the badge Emma had thrust back at her. The old lady who pays for everything. Is that really how they saw her? After all these years, all the birthday parties she hosted, all the Christmas mornings when she'd stayed up until 3 a.m. wrapping presents, all the times she'd dropped everything to babysit when Richard and Vivian needed a night out? Was she really nothing more than a checkbook with legs? This is what you think of me?" The French doors opened and Michael stepped out. At 26, Emma's older brother had Harold's gentle way of moving through the world, as if he understood that every person he encountered was carrying some invisible burden. "Grandma." He sat beside her on the bench, his presence immediately comforting. "I'm so sorry about that. I had no idea they were planning that." Margaret looked at her grandson, her firstborn grandchild, the one who still visits every Sunday for dinner, who had insisted on learning her recipe for Harold's favorite apple pie, and called just to check on her when storms knocked out power lines. "Did you know that's how they think of me, Michael? As just a source of money?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I've heard Dad and Mom talking about your house, about your finances. They seem to think you're not managing things well." "Not managing things well? I've managed just fine for the past 3 years, thank you very much. I balanced our family budget for 43 years of marriage. I managed the finances for the school district's library system for over 2 decades. I think I can handle my own checkbook." "I know that, Grandma. But they talk about the house being too big, too expensive to maintain. They think you should sell it and move into one of those senior communities." Margaret's chest tightened. The house wasn't just property. It was Harold's workshop where he built Emma's dollhouse and Michael's model airplanes. It was the kitchen where she taught both grandchildren to cook. It was the living room where Harold had proposed on Christmas Eve in 1978, 31 years old and nervous as a teenager. "They want me to sell the house." It wasn't a question. Michael nodded reluctantly. "Dad's been talking about having you declared incompetent, so he can take over your finances. For your own good," he says. The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack. Not her heart, exactly, but something deeper. The foundation of trust she'd built her life on. "And what do you think, Michael?" "And that she paid for this entire wedding, including the honeymoon to Greece that you told everyone was your gift to me." Margaret felt the world shift around her. Emma knew. Had known all along. "And I understand," Emma continued, "that instead of being grateful, instead of treating her with the love and respect she deserves, you decided to humiliate her at my wedding by reducing her to a joke." David appeared beside his new wife, his young face grave with an anger that matched Emma's. "Sir, ma'am, I think you should leave." "Leave?" Vivian's voice rose to a near shriek. "This is our daughter's wedding, and it's Grandma Maggie's house," Emma said firmly. "And her money that paid for everything, including your outfits, your meals, and your hotel rooms. So yes, I think you should leave." Margaret watched this unfold with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play rather than living through it. This was her family, tearing itself apart in her rose garden on what should have been one of the happiest days of any of their lives. Richard's face had gone from white to red. "Fine, but don't come crying to us when you realize you can't manage on your own anymore. Don't come crying to us when you fall down those stairs or forget to pay your bills or end up alone in that big empty house." "Richard," Margaret's voice was quiet, but something in it made everyone freeze. "Get out of my house, now." For a moment, father and son stared at each other across a chasm that seemed to widen with each breath. "You'll regret this. Both of you will." He turned and stalked back into the house, Vivian trailing behind him like a resentful shadow. Margaret could hear him inside, making loud excuses to the remaining guests, telling people that his mother was having one of her episodes and that the reception was ending early due to a family emergency. Emma sank down onto the bench, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "I'm so sorry, Grandma. I'm so sorry." Margaret sat beside her granddaughter and pulled her close, not caring about the expensive silk of the wedding dress. "Sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. But I do. I should have stopped them. I should have known they were going to do something like this." "How could you have known? I didn't even know." Michael sat on Emma's other side, and for a moment the three of them just breathed together in the gathering dusk. Inside, Margaret could hear car doors slamming, the sounds of the remaining guests leaving, and the catering staff beginning to clean up what should have been a celebration. "What do we do now?" Emma asked. Margaret looked at her granddaughter, this beautiful, fierce young woman who had just chosen her grandmother over her own parents, and felt something she hadn't experienced in the 3 years since Harold's death: hope. "Now we figure out what comes next, but together," she said. The house felt enormous and hollow the next morning. Margaret sat in her kitchen, still in her robe, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the previous day felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But the badge was still there on the counter where she'd left it, stark proof that it had all been real. The old lady who pays for everything. She picked it up again, studying it as if she could decode some hidden meaning in the plain black letters. Had Richard and Vivian sat down together and planned this? Had they laughed about it? Or had it been a spur-of-the-moment cruelty, the kind of thoughtless brutality that people inflicted when they stopped seeing someone as fully human? The doorbell rang and Margaret's heart jumped. Part of her hoped it might be Richard, coming to apologize, to take back the terrible things that had been said. She opened the door to find Michael standing on her porch with a bag of groceries and a grim expression. "I brought breakfast," he said, "and we need to talk." Michael had always been comfortable in her kitchen. Even as a child, he'd been drawn to the ritual of cooking, the way ingredients could be transformed into something nourishing and beautiful. This morning he moved with practiced efficiency, scrambling eggs, brewing fresh coffee, toasting the thick-cut bread from the bakery she loved. "Dad called me last night," he said without preamble. 3 times. Margaret's stomach clenched. "And?" "He wants me to talk to you about being reasonable. He says you're clearly not thinking straight, that yesterday proved you're becoming unstable." Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully. "And what did you tell him?" Michael flipped the eggs with more force than necessary. "I told him that the only unstable thing I saw yesterday was his behavior. But Grandma..." He turned to face her, and she saw Harold's gentle concern in his features. "He's not going to let this go. He's talking about lawyers, about having you evaluated. For what? Diminished capacity. He thinks if he can prove you're not competent to manage your own affairs, he can become your guardian." Margaret felt the walls of her kitchen pressing in around her. He can do that? He can try. The process isn't easy, but if he can find doctors willing to say you're not capable of making your own decisions. Michael slid a plate of eggs in front of her, but she couldn't imagine eating. "Grandma, how much money are we talking about here? I know Dad's been having financial problems, but I didn't realize how bad it was." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Harold had always handled their financial discussions, had been the one to meet with advisors and plan for their future. But she'd been involved in every decision, had understood every investment, every choice they'd made. "Your grandfather was very careful with money, very careful and very wise. Between his pension, my pension, Social Security, and our investments, I'm quite comfortable. More than comfortable." "How comfortable?" Margaret looked at her grandson, this kind, honest young man who had never asked her for anything, who visited every week and called just to check on her, and who had stood by her side when his own father tried to humiliate her. "Your grandfather was very careful with money," she said quietly. "Very careful and very wise. Between his pension, my pension, Social Security, and our investments, I'm quite comfortable. More than comfortable." "How comfortable?" Margaret looked at her grandson, this kind, honest young man who had never asked her for anything, who visited every week and called just to check on her, and who had stood by her side when his own father tried to humiliate her. "The house is worth about $2 million now. We have another $1.5 million in various investments, plus the life insurance policy Harold maintained until the day he died." Michael's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Jesus, Grandma, that's a lot of money." "Harold wanted to make sure I'd never have to depend on anyone," she said quietly. "He wanted me to have choices." Michael was quiet, processing this information. Outside, Margaret could hear the sounds of Sunday morning, lawnmowers starting up, dogs barking, the distant sound of church bells from St. Matthew's, where she and Harold had been married. "No wonder Dad's so desperate," he said finally. "Is that what you think this is? Desperation?" Michael met her eyes directly. "I think Dad lost his way somewhere. I think he's forgotten who you are, who raised him. I think he sees dollar signs instead of his mother." He paused and added, "But I also think he's scared." "Scared of what?" "Of being the kind of man who can't provide for his family. Of being seen as a failure. of having to admit that his mother is more successful than he is. Michael pushed eggs around on his plate. That doesn't excuse what he did yesterday, but maybe it explains it. Margaret considered this. Richard had always been competitive, even as a child. Harold used to joke that their son kept score in games that nobody else knew they were playing. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe what had happened yesterday wasn't pure greed, but a twisted form of pride. It doesn't matter, she said finally. What he did was unforgivable. Was it? I mean, I'm not defending him, but people do terrible things when they're desperate. Maybe if you talked to him, if you helped him understand that you're not trying to control him or make him feel small. Michael. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Yesterday, your father handed me a name tag that reduced me to nothing more than a source of money. He did it in front of 100 people. At his daughter's wedding, knowing it would humiliate me. And when I was hurt by it, he told me I was being dramatic and embarrassing his family. Michael was quiet. That wasn't desperation, sweetheart. That was cruelty. And I won't pretend otherwise, not even to keep peace in the family. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock Harold had bought for their 20th anniversary. Margaret stared out the window at her garden, at the roses Harold had planted for her 30 years ago, and felt the weight of every year they'd been together, and every year she'd been without him. Grandma, Michael said finally, there's something else. She looked at him. Emma and David want to postpone their honeymoon. They want to stay here with you for a while. Make sure you're okay. Margaret's throat tightened. They can't do that. They're newlyweds. They need time together. Time to start their marriage properly. They're worried about you. After what happened yesterday, they're afraid Dad might try something while they're gone. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the kitchen tiles. She walked to the window and stared out at Harold's roses, trying to find some calm in their familiar beauty. I won't be the person who ruins their honeymoon, she said. I won't be the old lady who becomes such a burden that young people can't live their lives. You're not a burden, Grandma, aren't I? She turned back to face him. Yesterday, I was the old lady who pays for everything. Today, I'm the old lady who needs protection from her own son. Tomorrow, I'll be the old lady who's too fragile to be left alone. When does it end, Michael? When do I stop being a person and become just a problem to be managed? Michael's eyes filled with the same stubborn compassion she'd seen in Harold's face 1,000 times. You're not a problem to be managed. You're family. You're the most important person in Emma's life, and mine. And we're not going to let Dad or anyone else treat you like you don't matter. Margaret's felt tears threatening, and she pushed them back. She'd cried enough over the past 24 hours. What do you think I should do? I think you should fight, Michael said without hesitation. I think you should show Dad exactly who he's messing with. And I think you should let Emma and David postpone their honeymoon for a week or two, just until we figure out what Dad's next move is going to be. Margaret considered this. She thought about Emma's fierce loyalty the day before, about David standing up to his new in-laws, about Michael sitting in her kitchen on a Sunday morning instead of with whatever young woman he was dating. Your grandfather always said that family was the most important thing in the world. He also said that family meant the people who loved you unconditionally, not necessarily the people who shared your DNA. Michael smiled. And for a moment, he looked exactly like Harold had at 26. Grandpa was a smart man. Yes, he was. Smarter than I ever gave him credit for. She walked to the old oak desk in the corner of the kitchen, the one Harold had used to pay bills and write letters to the editor about school board policies. In the bottom drawer, beneath old tax returns and warranty cards for long-dead appliances, was a manila envelope with her name written on the outside in Harold's careful handwriting. She'd found it 3 days after his funeral, when she was finally strong enough to start going through his papers. Inside was a letter dated just 6 months before his death, along with some legal documents she'd never had the courage to read. What's that? Michael asked. Margaret stared at the envelope. I think it's time to find out what your grandfather really thought about family. Harold's handwriting was as precise and careful as everything else he'd done in life. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread in front of her, Michael reading over her shoulder, both of them holding their breath. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, Then I've gone ahead without you, and I'm sorry for that. I always hoped we'd go together, the way we did everything else for 43 years. I need you to know that the past 4 decades with you have been the greatest gift of my life. You made me a better man, a better father, and a better human being. I hope I did the same for you. But I'm writing this letter because I'm worried about what will happen to you after I'm gone. Not because I don't trust your judgment. You've always been the smarter one between us, and we both know it. I'm worried because I've been watching our son, and I don't like what I see. Margaret's chest tightened. Harold had seen it too, whatever had been growing in Richard, the gradual hardening that she tried so hard to ignore. Richard has always struggled with money, with feeling like he's not successful enough. I've tried to help him build confidence, to support him without making him feel small. But I think I may have failed him somehow. The more we've helped, the more resentful he's become. I'm afraid that when I'm gone, he'll see you as an obstacle to what he thinks should be his inheritance, rather than as his mother who deserves love and respect. I'm afraid he'll try to convince you that you can't manage on your own, that you need him to take care of you. Maggie, you are the strongest, most capable person I've ever known. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Margaret had to stop reading for a moment, overcome by the sound of Harold's voice in her head, by the way he'd anticipated exactly what would happen. I've made some legal arrangements that I hope you'll never need to use. Jonathan Ashford at Ashford, Pierce & Associates has all the details. He's been our attorney for 15 years, and he understands our family situation. The most important thing you need to know is this. I've included a provision in my will that protects you from anyone who tries to take advantage of your generosity or who treats you with public disrespect. Anyone who humiliates you, who tries to have you declared incompetent, or who otherwise behaves in a way that would dishonor your dignity will forfeit any claim to our estate. This includes Richard. I didn't make this decision lightly, Maggie. I've watched him over the years, seen the way he talks to you sometimes when he thinks I'm not listening, seen the way Vivian rolls her eyes when you're being too generous with the grandchildren. I've seen the calculations in their eyes when they look at this house, at our bank statements. I won't let them treat you like a burden in your own life. Michael whistled low. Holy shit, Grandpa. Sorry, Grandma, but holy shit. Margaret kept reading, her hands shaking slightly. The legal documents in this envelope outline exactly what constitutes grounds for disinheritance. Public humiliation is clearly defined, as is any attempt to have you declared mentally incompetent against your will. Jonathan has instructions to be very generous in his interpretation of these clauses. I want to be clear. This isn't about punishing Richard. It's about protecting you. If he treats you with the love and respect you deserve, if he supports your independence and honors your choices, then everything will go to him and the grandchildren exactly as we've always planned. But if he doesn't, well, Emma and Michael have always understood what family really means. There's one more thing, and it's the most important part of this letter. I've established a trust that ensures you'll be financially secure for the rest of your life, regardless of what happens with the rest of the estate. You will never have to depend on anyone for anything. You will never have to accept being treated poorly because you need someone to take care of you. You are not a burden. You are not just a source of money for people to exploit. You are a remarkable woman who deserves to live your remaining years with dignity, independence, and joy. I love you more than words can express. Take care of yourself, trust your instincts, and remember that family means the people who love you for who you are, not what you can give them. All my love, always. Harold. Margaret sat in silence for a long time after she finished reading, feeling Harold's presence so strongly it was almost like having him in the room again. He knew, she said finally. He saw what Richard was becoming, and he tried to protect me from it. Michael was staring at the legal documents that had been included with the letter. Grandma, according to this, what Dad did yesterday, the name tag, the public humiliation, that's grounds for disinheritance under the terms of your grandfather's will. Margaret felt a strange calm settling over her. I need to call Jonathan Ashford. What are you wanting to do? She looked at her grandson, this young man who had inherited all of Harold's best qualities and none of Richard's resentments. I'm going to find out exactly what your grandfather has given me the power to do. Jonathan Ashford had silver hair and the kind of steady presence that came from 40 years of helping families navigate their most difficult moments. His office was lined with law books and family photos, comfortable without being ostentatious. I've been expecting this call for 3 years, he said after Margaret finished explaining what had happened at the wedding. Harold was very clear about what he thought might happen. You helped him write these provisions? I tried to talk him out of them, actually. Not because they weren't legal, they're ironclad, but because family disputes over inheritance can get very ugly. Harold was insistent. He said he'd rather have clear consequences than let you be mistreated. Margaret spread the legal documents across Jonathan's desk. Explain to me exactly what this means. Jonathan put on his reading glasses and pulled the papers closer. Harold's will contains what's called a no contest clause, with very specific behavioral requirements. Anyone who stands to inherit from the estate, which in this case means Richard, since the grandchildren's inheritances are protected in separate trusts, must treat you with what the document calls appropriate respect and dignity. And if they don't? If they publicly humiliate you, attempt to have you declared mentally incompetent against your wishes, try to coerce you into financial decisions, or otherwise behave in ways that Harold felt were inconsistent with the love and respect you deserve, they forfeit their inheritance entirely. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Richard would lose everything? His portion would be redistributed according to Harold's secondary beneficiary instructions. The house would go to you outright, along with additional funds to maintain it for as long as you live. When you pass away, everything would go to Emma and Michael. What about Vivian? Harold was very clear that Vivian was never intended to be a direct beneficiary. Any inheritance she might have expected would have come through Richard. Margaret sat back in her chair, trying to process the full implications of what Harold had done. He hadn't just protected her financially, he'd given her the power to hold her family accountable for how they treated her. There's something else you should know, Jonathan continued. Harold established what he called a dignity fund, a separate account specifically designed to give you resources to protect yourself if anyone tried to take advantage of you. Legal fees, private investigators, security systems, medical advocates, whatever you need to maintain your independence. How much? $500,000, with instructions that it should be replenished from the estate as needed. Margaret stared at him. Even 3 years after Harold's death, he was still taking care of her, still anticipating what she might need. Jonathan, I need you to understand something. I don't want to destroy my family. Richard is my son, whatever he's done. These past few days have been... She trailed off, searching for words. I feel like I'm living through the death of someone I thought I knew. What do you want to do? Margaret was quiet for a long time, thinking about the badge that still sat on her kitchen counter, about Richard's threats the night before, about Emma's fierce loyalty and Michael's steady support. I want Richard to have a chance to make this right, she said finally. But I also want him to understand that there are consequences for his actions. Is there a way to warn him, to let him know what's at stake without actually triggering the disinheritance clause? Jonathan nodded slowly. I could request a meeting with Richard and his attorney, if he has one, to discuss the terms of Harold's will. It would be a way of making sure he understands the situation without being accusatory. Would you do that? Of course. But, Margaret, you need to understand that once Richard knows about these provisions, he might become even more desperate. People facing the loss of a significant inheritance can become unpredictable. Margaret thought about this. What kinds of things might he do? He might try to challenge the will directly, claim that Harold wasn't of sound mind when he wrote these provisions. He might escalate his attempts to have you declared incompetent. hoping to invalidate Harold's behavioral requirements. Or he might try to manipulate you emotionally, make you feel guilty for enforcing consequences. And if he does any of those things, if he challenges the will or tries to have you declared incompetent against your wishes, that would trigger the disinheritance clause immediately. Harold was very specific about that. Margaret nodded, then set up the meeting. Let Richard know what he stands to lose, and give him a chance to choose how he wants to move forward. And if he chooses badly, Margaret met Jonathan's eyes directly. Then he'll have to live with the consequences of treating his mother like the old lady who pays for everything. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 a.m. Margaret spent the intervening days in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of her normal routine while feeling like she was waiting for her life to restart. Emma and David had postponed their honeymoon, despite Margaret's protests, and were staying in the guest room. The house felt more alive with them there. Emma singing while she made coffee in the morning, David reading the newspaper out loud at breakfast, both of them treating Margaret not like a fragile elderly woman, but like the competent adult she'd always been. Michael came by every evening after work, ostensibly to check on everyone, but really, Margaret suspected, to provide moral support for whatever was coming. On Wednesday night, Richard called. "Mom, I understand you've been talking to lawyers." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Hello, Richard. Don't you think you're being a little dramatic? All of this because of a misunderstanding at Emma's wedding." A misunderstanding? The name tag was Vivian's idea, and it was supposed to be a joke. You're blowing this completely out of proportion. Margaret felt something cold and hard settling in her chest. Even now, even after everything that had happened, Richard couldn't bring himself to acknowledge how cruel the joke had been. "Richard, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you broke Mrs. Henderson's window with a baseball?" There was a pause. "What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what your father and I taught you about taking responsibility for your actions?" "Mom, I'm not 8 years old." "No, you're not. Which makes your behavior even more disappointing." Richard's voice hardened. "I'm trying to be reasonable here. I'm trying to work with you. But if you insist on making this into some kind of legal battle, then maybe it's time we all faced some hard truths, such as the fact that you're 71 years old and living alone in a house that's too big for you. Such as the fact that you're making impulsive decisions based on hurt feelings rather than logic. Such as the fact that maybe Dad was wrong to leave you with so much responsibility." Margaret closed her eyes. There it was, the threat she'd been expecting. "Richard, I'll see you tomorrow at the lawyer's office, 10 a.m. "Mom, wait!" She hung up the phone. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face concerned. "Grandma, are you okay?" Margaret looked at her granddaughter, this beautiful young woman who had stood up for her when her own son wouldn't, and felt Harold's presence so strongly, it took her breath away. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. What did Dad say?" "He reminded me exactly why your grandfather felt these legal protections were necessary." Jonathan Ashford's conference room felt like a courtroom, despite the comfortable leather chairs and polished mahogany table. Margaret sat with Michael on one side and Emma on the other, drawing strength from their presence. Across the table, Richard sat with a lawyer Margaret didn't recognize, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit who looked like she specialized in hostile takeovers. "Thank you all for coming," Jonathan began. "I've asked for this meeting to ensure that everyone understands the specific terms of Harold Whitmore's will, particularly as they relate to Mrs. Whitmore's ongoing care and dignity." Richard's lawyer leaned forward. "My client is here under protest. We believe this meeting is premature and potentially inflammatory. Your client is free to leave at any time, but given recent events, I thought it would be prudent to clarify certain legal realities before anyone takes actions they might regret." He opened Harold's will to a section marked with colored tabs. Mr. Whitmore was very specific about his expectations regarding how his widow should be treated by her family. I'm going to read the relevant section verbatim. Margaret watched Richard's face as Jonathan read the behavioral requirements, the consequences for public humiliation, the provisions for disinheritance. She saw the exact moment when Richard understood what he stood to lose. His face went pale, then flushed deep red. "This is ridiculous," Richard said when Jonathan finished reading. "Dad was manipulating us from beyond the grave. Harold was protecting his wife," Michael said quietly. "There's a difference." Richard's lawyer was taking rapid notes. "We'll need time to review these documents thoroughly. Some of these provisions seem potentially challengeable." "On what grounds?" "Mental capacity, for one thing. Undue influence from other family members for another." Margaret felt a chill. She'd expected this, but hearing it stated so baldly was still shocking. "I should point out," Jonathan said, "that challenging the will on those grounds would itself constitute grounds for disinheritance under Section 12b, which specifically addresses attempts to invalidate Harold's testamentary choices." "That's circular reasoning," Richard's lawyer began. "That's Harold Wintmore being very, very careful. He anticipated every possible challenge and built in protections accordingly." Richard was staring at Margaret with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, not resentment, but something that looked almost like fear. "Mom, surely you don't want this. Surely you don't want to see our family destroyed over a misunderstanding." Margaret looked at her son, this man she'd raised, this person she'd loved unconditionally for 45 years, and felt her heart breaking all over again. "Richard, what do you think your father was protecting me from?" "I don't know what you mean." "When Harold wrote these provisions, what kind of behavior was he anticipating? What did he think might happen that would require legal consequences to prevent?" Richard was quiet. "He was protecting me from being treated exactly the way you treated me at Emma's wedding. He was protecting me from being seen as nothing more than a source of money, from being humiliated in front of my family and friends, from having my own son threaten to have me declared incompetent because I wouldn't let him control my life. Mom, he was protecting me from having to choose between my dignity and my family. And you know what the saddest part is, Richard? He hoped he was wrong. He hoped these provisions would never be needed." Richard's lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head. "What do you want from me, Mom? What would it take to fix this?" Margaret felt the weight of 45 years of motherhood, of all the times she'd protected Richard from the consequences of his choices, all the times she'd made excuses for his behavior or minimized his failures to spare his feelings. "I want you to understand that I am not the old lady who pays for everything. I am your mother. I am a woman who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of how much money I have or how old I am. I understand that. Do you? Because 3 days ago, you handed me a name tag reducing me to a walking ATM. Last night, you threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent. Today, you brought a lawyer to a family meeting about your father's will." Richard looked down at his hands. "I was angry. I said things I didn't mean." "Which things didn't you mean, Richard? The name tag, the threats, or the assumption that I'm too old and stupid to manage my own life?" The conference room fell silent. Margaret could hear Jonathan's grandfather clock, the distant sound of traffic on the street below. "I want to fix this," Richard said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then here's what's going to happen," Margaret said, feeling Harold's strength flowing through her words. "You're going to go home and think about what kind of man you want to be. You're going to think about what your father would say if he could see how you've been treating me. And you're going to decide whether you want to be my son or my adversary." "Mom, I'm not finished. If you choose to be my son, my real son, not someone who sees me as an obstacle to an inheritance, then you'll call me next week and apologize. Not for a misunderstanding, not for a joke that went wrong, but for treating me cruelly and threatening my independence." Richard nodded mutely. "If you choose to be my adversary, if you try to challenge your father's will, or have me declared incompetent, or continue to treat me like a burden, then you'll discover exactly how much power Harold gave me to protect myself." Margaret stood up, suddenly feeling every one of her 71 years, but also feeling stronger than she had in months. "The choice is yours, Richard, but choose carefully. Because I won't give you another chance to humiliate me,
and I won't pretend anymore that your behavior is acceptable just to keep peace in the family." She walked out of the conference room with Emma and Michael flanking her like an honor guard, leaving Richard and his lawyer to contemplate the smoking ruins of what had once been a comfortable assumption about easy money and compliant mothers. The next week passed slowly. Margaret found herself listening for the phone, jumping slightly every time it rang, hoping and dreading in equal measure that it would be Richard calling to apologize. Instead, she got calls from other family members. Harold's sister Dorothy calling to check on her after hearing rumors about problems at the wedding. Margaret's own sister Ruth calling from Florida to see if the stories Vivian had been spreading about Margaret's mental decline were true. "I told her you were sharp as a tack," Ruth said during their conversation. "Told her if anyone in that family was losing their marbles, it wasn't you." Margaret found herself laughing for the first time in days. "Ruth, you've always been terrible. Terrible, but honest. Now tell me what's really going on up there." Margaret found herself recounting the whole story. The name tag, the confrontation, Harold's secret provisions, the meeting with the lawyers. Ruth listened without interrupting, making occasional sounds of disgust or surprise. "That bastard," Ruth said when Margaret finished. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I know he's your son, but Harold was right to protect you from him. I keep thinking I must have failed somewhere. That if I'd been a better mother or if Harold and I had handled things differently, stop that right now. You raised that boy the same way you did everything else, with love and attention and more patience than most people deserve. If he chose to become the kind of man who'd humiliate his own mother, that's on him, not you." Margaret felt tears threatening again. "I just never thought he could be so cruel." "People can be cruel when they're scared, Maggie. And from what you've told me, Richard has plenty to be scared about. But being scared doesn't excuse treating your mother like garbage." "I don't know what to do next, Ruth. Part of me wants to forgive him and pretend this never happened. Part of me wants to activate Harold's provisions and cut him off entirely. What does your gut tell you?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, listening to her sister's breathing across the 1,000 miles that separated them. "My gut tells me that Harold knew exactly what kind of man our son was becoming, and that's why he wrote those provisions. My gut tells me that if I let Richard get away with this, it'll only get worse. Then trust your gut. And trust Harold. That man loved you more than life itself, and he wouldn't have done anything to hurt you even after death." That night, Margaret sat in Harold's study, surrounded by his books and papers, trying to feel his presence. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne and the pipe tobacco he'd smoked on special occasions. His reading glasses were still on the desk, as if he'd just stepped out for a moment. "I miss you," she said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but needing to say the words. "I miss you so much, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this without you." The house was quiet around her, Emma and David having gone out for dinner, Michael at his own apartment. For a moment, Margaret let herself feel the full weight of her loneliness, the empty spaces where Harold's laughter used to be, the absence of his steady presence beside her in bed every night. But then she thought about the letter he'd written, about the care he'd taken to protect her, about the way he'd anticipated exactly what might happen and given her the tools to defend herself. Harold hadn't left her alone. He'd left her prepared. The phone rang, startling her out of her reverie. For a moment, her heart leaped. Maybe it was Richard, finally ready to apologize. But the caller ID showed Vivian's number. Margaret almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Hello, Vivian." "Margaret." Vivian's voice was crisp and cold. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." "I'm listening." "You tell me that you've been threatening him with some kind of legal action. I want you to know that we won't be intimidated." Margaret felt a familiar weariness settle over her. "I haven't threatened anyone, Vivian. I've simply made sure that Richard understands the consequences of his choices." "His choices? What about your choices, Margaret? What about the choice to turn your back on your only son over a silly misunderstanding? Is that what you think happened? A silly misunderstanding? I think you're a lonely old woman who's letting hurt feelings destroy her family." Margaret felt something snap inside her chest, some final thread of patience or diplomacy that she'd been holding on to out of habit. "Vivian, let me be very clear about something. I am not lonely. I am surrounded by people who love and respect me. I'm not old in any way that matters. I am experienced and wise and perfectly capable of managing my own life. And I am not destroying my family. I am protecting myself from family members who have chosen to treat me badly. You're being ridiculous. No, I'm being strong. There's a difference, though I understand why you might not recognize it. Vivian was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could practically hear her recalibrating. Margaret, surely you don't want to see Richard and the children suffer financially because of a moment of poor judgment. The children are protected, Vivian. Harold made sure of that. It's only Richard who stands to lose anything, and only if he continues to choose poorly. You're punishing him for one mistake. I'm holding him accountable for a pattern of behavior that culminated in public humiliation. There's a difference. What if he apologizes? What if he admits he was wrong? Margaret felt a spark of hope. Is he ready to do that? There was a long pause. He's having trouble with the idea of apologizing to you. Why? Another pause, longer this time. He feels like you're backing him into a corner. You're using Dad's will to control him. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the last of her hope die. Vivian, if Richard can't understand the difference between being held accountable and being controlled, then he's not ready to apologize. And I'm not going to beg my own son to treat me with basic human decency. Margaret, I'm done with this conversation. When Richard is ready to take responsibility for his actions, all of them, not just the name tag, but the threats and the disrespect and the assumption that I'm too senile to manage my own life, then he can call me himself. Till then, I don't want to hear from either of you. Margaret hung up the phone and sat in Harold's chair, feeling emotionally drained, but somehow lighter, as if she'd finally put down a weight she'd been carrying for too long. 2 weeks passed. Margaret fell into a new routine, one that didn't include waiting for Richard's call or hoping for reconciliation. Emma and David had finally left for their postponed honeymoon, but not before making Margaret promise to call them if anything happened. Michael continued his evening visits, but the conversations gradually shifted from crisis management to normal life. His work as a software engineer, her plans for the garden next spring, their shared memories of Harold. On a Thursday evening in early November, Margaret was in the kitchen making Harold's apple pie recipe when the doorbell rang. Through the window, she could see Richard standing on her porch, alone. Her first instinct was to pretend she wasn't home, but she was 71 years old, too old for games, and besides, this conversation was inevitable. She opened the door to find her son looking older than his 45 years, his face drawn and tired. "Mom, can we talk?" Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of the anger or manipulation she'd grown to expect. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine remorse. "Come in." They sat in the living room where Richard had played with toy trucks as a child, where he'd brought girlfriends to meet his parents, where he'd announced his engagement to Vivian 20 years ago. The room held 45 years of memories, most of them good. "I owe you an apology," Richard said without preamble. "A real one, not the half-hearted attempt I made at the lawyer's office." Margaret waited. "I've been thinking about what you said, about what Dad would think if he could see how I've been treating you. And the truth is, he'd be ashamed of me. He'd be angry and disappointed and probably wouldn't want to claim me as his son." Richard's voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Margaret felt her maternal instincts stirring despite everything. The name tag was cruel. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was me reducing you to nothing more than a source of money because that's how I'd started thinking about you. And I'm ashamed of that. Margaret felt tears threatening, but she held them back. She needed to hear all of this. "I threatened to have you declared incompetent, not because I was worried about your mental state, but because I was panicking about money and I thought controlling your finances would solve my problems. That was selfish and wrong and incredibly disrespectful." "Why, Richard? Why did money become more important than our relationship?" Richard was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. "I don't know when it started. Maybe when the business began failing and I realized I wasn't as good at managing money as I thought I was. Maybe when I had to start accepting help from you and Dad, and it made me feel like a failure as a provider. He looked up at her, and she saw the little boy he once was, the one who used to cry when he disappointed her.
I think I started resenting the fact that you were more successful than me, that you and Dad had built this comfortable life while I was struggling to keep my head above water. And instead of being grateful for your help, I started feeling entitled to it. Margaret felt her heart breaking for the pain she heard in his voice, even as she maintained her resolve. When did I stop being your mother and become a problem to be managed? I don't know. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as an asset, a resource. And I hate myself for that. They sat in silence for several minutes, the grandfather clock ticking away the seconds. Mom, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for your forgiveness. Not because I'm worried about the inheritance, although I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it, but because I love you and I can't stand the thought that I might have destroyed our relationship permanently. Margaret looked at her son, this man she'd raised, this person she'd loved unconditionally for 45 years, and felt Harold's presence in the room with them. Richard, I forgive you. I forgave you the moment you walked through that door with genuine remorse in your eyes. Relief flooded his face. Thank you. Mom, thank you. But forgiveness doesn't mean there won't be consequences, and it doesn't mean I'm going to pretend this never happened. Richard nodded. I understand. Do you? Because I need you to understand that something fundamental has changed between us. I will always love you, but I will never again allow you to treat me with disrespect. I will never again make excuses for your behavior or minimize your choices to spare your feelings. I understand. Your father gave me the tools to protect myself, Richard, and I will use them if I have to. I love you, but I love myself too, and I won't sacrifice my dignity to maintain a relationship with someone who doesn't value me as a person. You won't have to. I swear to you, Mom, you won't have to. Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulative anger she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Her son taking full responsibility for his actions. There's something else we need to discuss. Your financial situation. Richard tensed. Mom, I know you weren't, but we can't move forward without addressing the elephant in the room. Richard, I've been covering your mortgage for 2 years. I paid for Emma's entire college education. I've been supplementing your family's income in various ways for almost a decade. Richard's face flushed with shame. I know. I'm grateful. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I'm telling you this because those days are over. Richard looked like he'd been slapped. What do you mean? You're a 45-year-old man, and it's time you learned to manage your own finances without depending on your mother. I will continue to pay Emma's student loans because that was a commitment I made to her. But everything else stops now. Mom, I don't think you understand how precarious our situation is. I understand perfectly, and I understand that as long as I keep rescuing you from the consequences of your financial decisions, you'll never learn to make better ones. Margaret stood up and walked to Harold's desk, returning with the folder she'd prepared. I've spoken with a financial advisor about your situation. Based on your income and expenses, if you sell the boat, trade in Vivian's BMW for something more practical, and cut your discretionary spending by about 30%, you can afford your mortgage without my help. Richard stared at the paper she'd handed him. You want me to sell the boat? I want you to make adult decisions about your priorities. If keeping the boat is more important to you than maintaining your independence from your elderly mother, then keep the boat and figure out another solution. Richard was quiet for a long time, reading through the financial analysis. This is going to be hard, he said finally. Yes, it is. But you're capable of hard things, Richard. You're intelligent and resourceful, and you're perfectly capable of living within your means if you choose to. What if I can't do it?
What if I fail? Margaret felt her heart soften slightly. Then you'll figure out another way. But you'll do it as an independent adult, not as a middle-aged man dependent on his mother. Richard nodded slowly. I can do this. I will do this. I believe you can. But Richard, this isn't negotiable. I'm not giving you a loan to tide you over until things get better. I'm not going to bail you out if you make poor choices. This is your chance to prove that you can be the man your father raised you to be. They talked for another hour, working through the practical details of Richard's new financial independence. When he finally left, Margaret felt exhausted, but hopeful. She called Emma in Greece that night. How did it go, Grandma? I think your father remembered who he used to be, Margaret said. Whether he can stay that person remains to be seen. And if he can't? Margaret looked around Harold's study, at the pictures of their life together, at the books they'd read aloud to each other, at the evidence of 43 years of partnership and love. Then I'll be fine without him. Your grandfather made sure of that. Christmas came quietly that year. Richard and Vivian hosted dinner at their house, a smaller affair than usual, without the boat payments to worry about. Vivian was politely distant, but not openly hostile. Richard was attentive without being obsequious, asking about Margaret's plans for the new year and listening to her answers with genuine interest. Emma and David glowed with newlywed happiness, sharing stories from their Greek honeymoon and their plans to buy a small house in the spring. Michael brought his new girlfriend, a teacher named Sarah, who made him laugh and clearly adored him. Margaret watched her family gathered around the table and felt Harold's presence so strongly she almost turned to share a private smile with him. This was what he'd wanted to protect, not the money or the house or the inheritance, but the possibility of moments like this, when love mattered more than resentment and family meant something more than financial obligation. After dinner, Richard walked her to her car. Mom, I want you to know that these past 2 months have been the hardest and the best months I've had in years. How so? Hard because learning to live within our means has meant making sacrifices I didn't want to make. Vivian wasn't happy about giving up the BMW, and I missed the boat more than I expected to. Margaret waited for the rest. But also the best because I feel like myself again. I feel like the man Dad raised me to be, instead of someone always scrambling to keep up appearances or looking for the next bailout. Margaret smiled. Your father would be proud of you. I hope so. And Mom, thank you. For what? For loving me enough to hold me accountable. For not giving up on me even when I gave you every reason to. Margaret hugged her son, feeling like she was embracing the boy she'd raised rather than the stranger he'd become. I will always love you, Richard, but I will never again let you mistake my love for weakness. I know. And I'm grateful for that, even if it took me a while to understand it. As Margaret drove home through the quiet Christmas evening, she felt Harold beside her in the passenger seat, felt his approval in the warm glow of the dashboard lights. We did good, didn't we? She said aloud, with the kids, with the family, with each other. We did good. At home, she found a letter waiting on her doorstep, hand-delivered in Emma's familiar handwriting. Dearest Grandma Maggie, David and I have been talking about legacy, about the kind of people we want to be, the kind of family we want to build together. We keep coming back to you and Grandpa Harold as our models. Not because you were perfect, though you came pretty close, but because you understood what family really means. You understood that love without respect is just sentimentality, that support without accountability is just enabling, that being family means choosing each other every day, not just accepting shared DNA. You taught Dad that lesson again this year, and it wasn't easy for any of us, but watching you stand up for yourself, watching you refuse to accept being treated poorly just to keep peace, that was one of the most important lessons I've ever learned. I want to be that kind of woman. Strong enough to demand respect, loving enough to forgive, wise enough to know the difference between the two. David and I have decided to name our first daughter Margaret, if you don't mind sharing the name. We want her to have something to live up to. All our love, Emma and David. P.S. Grandpa Harold was the luckiest man in the world, and he knew it. Margaret sat in Harold's chair, reading the letter again and again, feeling tears of joy rather than sadness for the first time in months. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the roses Harold had planted for her 30 years ago. The house was quiet around her, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful. She thought about the badge that still sat in her kitchen drawer, the one that had started this whole journey. The old lady who pays for everything. She'd kept it as a reminder, a talisman of the moment when she'd decided that her dignity was worth more than family peace at any cost. But maybe it was time to throw it away. Maybe it was time to replace it with something else. A reminder not of what she'd endured, but of what she'd become. She walked to Harold's desk and pulled out a piece of his personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with their names embossed at the top. In her careful handwriting, she wrote, Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, mother, grandmother, and beloved wife of Harold James Whitmore, a woman who knows her worth and insists that others recognize it too. She pinned it to the refrigerator next to Emma's wedding photo, right where Harold would have seen it every morning when he made his coffee. What do you think? She asked aloud, feeling his presence in the quiet kitchen. Better than the original? Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in clean white silence. Inside, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and settled in to plan her 72nd year, a year that would be hers to live with dignity, independence, and the unshakable knowledge that she was loved for exactly who she was. The badge was forgotten in the kitchen drawer, where it belonged. This was what mattered. A family learning to love each other properly, a woman learning to value herself appropriately, and the lasting wisdom of a man who had understood that the greatest gift he could give his wife was the power to protect herself. Harold had been right about everything, as usual. Family wasn't about blood or obligation or financial dependency. Family was about choosing to love and respect each other every single day, and having the courage to demand that love and respect in return. Margaret sipped her tea and watched the snow fall, feeling Harold's love surrounding her like a warm blanket, feeling grateful for everything they'd built together and everything she'd learned to build on her own. She was not the old lady who paid for everything. She was Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, and she was exactly who she was supposed to be.